6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to a potentially enchanted forest. Beautiful afternoon. Time for a creepy story. As you listen, make sure to watch behind me, as you never know who or what may or may not show up in the background. You never know what sort of faces you may or may not see in the trees and the bushes and the leaves and the shrubs. You're going to be finding out a lot more about that soon, though, I'll tell you that. But today's story comes to mind by way of something good that happened here recently within the last week or so. I was walking around on our property here on the homestead one morning after going out for a run, doing my cool down walk, and I noticed a bush/tree that I've wanted to have the whole time we've been here, but I've not gotten around to getting one, and it just happened to sprout up and appear naturally. And that is an elderberry bush. If you're not familiar with elderberries, they're these tiny little dark purple, almost black berries. They're about the size of BBs that you would shoot out of a BB gun, and they grow in these big bunches, big clumps. They're sweet, very seedy, but they make great jams, they make great pies, they make great everything. They're indigenous to much of the east coast of the United States. I've seen them around, but not on our property. I was actually going to, the last couple of years, meant to buy one and just put it here. But one came up. I guess a bird had been eating some elderberries, came along, sat on a branch and excremented, and the seed, after going through strategization over a winter, took root and sprouted. And okay, that's enough about this bush. Let me tell you about the collection of elderberry bushes that I remembered from having seen this elderberry bush, which brings us to today's creepy story. So, have you ever wondered how certain locations, certain communities, certain little wide spots in the road got their names? There's some crazily named places out there all over the world, but even here in America. I remember when I was taking this cross-country trip, I think I was somewhere in Texas, and I crossed a small bridge and went over a small stream, and the name of the stream was Screaming Woman Creek. And I thought, gosh, how would a place get a name like Screaming Woman Creek? What must have happened to some poor damsel in that area to have the creek named Screaming Woman Creek? I don't know. I never got the answer to that question. I don't think I ever asked anybody. I just wondered it to myself. It's years ago. I still remember. You'd think I would have Googled it by now. Note to self, Google that when I'm done with this, if I remember. Well, let me tell you about a place called Burnt House. Burnt House, yeah, like a house that burnt. This is back in Appalachia. It was during my college years. I had a friend for a season, I guess, just some guy I knew from class or whatever. Lost touch, never kept touch. I think he dropped out and never came back to school. But he asked me once if I'd like to go spend the weekend with him, meet his family. They had a farm somewhere there in rural Appalachia. So we did. We went, spent the weekend with him, and his grandmother lived with him. She was probably 80-ish at the time. The elderberries were ripe that time of year. It was like late fall, might have even been October. And she asked us if we would go pick some for her because she wanted to make some of the jams and jellies and pies that I was just telling you about. All right, now when the crows start coming in, at least in videos past, that's when the weird stuff started happening. So keep looking back here for all things weird. So anyway, yeah, she tells us she wants to get some elderberries. And so the guy says, okay, well, where should we go, Grandma? And she says, well, they're everywhere out there. You got to find them. Just don't get any from the Burnt House area. Go on past that holler and going up to the next one. He's like, I know, Grandma. I'm not going to stop off at Burnt House. So we go out. We get in he had a Jeep Wrangler. and we had the top off because it was wonderful weather. We're going up the road, just this old country road, and I'm like, so what is up with burnt house, and why should we not go there? And he said, oh, grandma's superstitious. She's just an old country person, been here her whole life, never left Appalachian, and there's just this holler. Most people would say hollow, but in Appalachian we called them hollers, like the Legend of Sleepy Holler, called burnt house. There's nothing really there except like an old stone fireplace from where there was a house there that had burned. And I said, well, that's neat. And he says, well, it's just right up here on the left. Let's go up here and I'll show you. You can see it. We'll just turn around right there, and then we'll go up and find these elderberries. So I said, okay. So he takes a left, goes up this dirt road just a little ways, and there's like a lot, but it's grown up to the point of being a young forest. It's younger than this one. This was last forested probably 20, 25 years ago, and you can see there's already sizable trees here. So this part of the lot where the house wasn't quite this grown up, though he told me the place hadn't been lived in about a century. So he pulls in to turn around, and I say, well, my gosh, look at all those elderberries right there where it looks like where the house used to be. Let's get those. And he goes, oh, no, we can't get those. If Grandma knows where we got those, she'll never use them. Even though we're, 20-ish, she'll tan our hides for not following her directions. And we're looking at each other talking. And I looked over as he was talking, and I swear, in these elderberries, the bushes were grown up real thick, almost as thick as a rhododendron or a laurel thicket. And it looked to me like there were two guys standing there in the bushes. And I looked back at him and I said, well, those guys are picking elderberries from here. They're not stupid. They're not going to take a risk of going up the mountain and maybe or maybe not finding the elderberries. If they're good enough for them to get them, why don't we get them too? It's enough for everybody. He's looking out the windshield and he says, what two guys? So I look back over into the thicket of the elderberry bushes, and there's no guys there. They're gone. And so I'm looking around and I say, well, I could have sworn I just saw two guys. But we get out of the Jeep more out of curiosity than anything to look for these guys. So we're looking around. They're gone. And I don't know where they could have gone. There were no other vehicles. They had to have been on foot, but it's like they just vanished. And he asked me what they looked like, thinking maybe he knew them. And I said, well, one looked like he was probably early 40s. The other guy looked about our age at the time, which was 20-ish, early 20s. He says, well, I don't see him, and I don't know anybody that, and I told him they both had on hats, like black hats, kind of looked like old-fashioned hats, old-timey hats. He says, I don't know anybody around here who wears creepy old hats like that. But while we're here, let's get some of these elderberries. You're right. Let's get this done with, and we'll go maybe drink some cold ones here later and try to kill some squirrels or turkeys or whatever. Going to do some hunting. It's Appalachian, right, in the fall. So we start picking these berries, and I put some in my mouth just to eat while I was picking, and I'm telling you, they're delicious berries, but these things were so nasty, I spit them out. They were perfectly ripe. They were ripe to you touch them and they'd start leaking juice. That's how ripe they were, but they tasted like they were green. And about the time I spit that out, I got bit by a horsefly on the hand, as did my buddy. He's smacking away a horsefly. And I'm like, man, let's get out of here. These berries suck anyway. And I've never felt a horsefly bite like that in my life. So we turn around, we start walking back to his Jeep. By the time we get telling you, you keep watching, you keep looking, you keep listening. When you think you're alone in the forest, you're never alone, even if there's no one else there. So we get back to the Jeep, and our hands were swollen as if we'd been bitten by rattlesnakes or copperheads or stung by a yellow jacket. And he says, this isn't good. Let's get back to the house. And I said, yeah, let's go. So we're going back to get Benadryl or whatever, put ice on these things. And I've been getting bit by horse flies my whole life. I get bit by them around here in the summer. Never had a reaction like this ever. So we get back to his house. His grandma's there rocking on the porch. And she says, where's my elderberries? And he says, well, we couldn't get them, Grandma. We got bit by some kind of nasty horse flies, and we held up our hands. And she said, you boys sit right here and don't move a bit. So she goes in the house, and she comes out with like a poultice, however you say it. It's one of those words I don't say that much, so I probably mispronounce it. It looked like baking soda, vinegar, and some other stuff. So typical, Appalachian American type quick fix. And the stuff works. So she puts it on there. It's taking the sting out. She goes, you boys went to burnt house, didn't you? You boys tried picking them elderberries and probably growing up where that house got burnt. And we were like, yeah. And she just started scolding her grandson. I said, ma'am, I'm sorry we didn't listen to you, but what's the big deal? I said, it's just like the old foundation of an old house. You could see where the old stone chimney was, and a bunch of berries that were bitter as could be for some reason, some nasty horse flies. But what gives? What's up with all the cloak and dagger type stuff about this place? So she proceeds to tell us, and her grandson, until that day, had never heard this story. He'd been told always, don't go there, stay away. But until that day, he never knew. Here's why. Turns out that area, like so many places back in Appalachia, a century and a half or so ago, the only reason those communities existed was for companies to go in there and harvest the natural resources, either timber or coal or the oil and the gas. So this particular location was a timber type town, timber area, and the timber companies would build these small houses, and loggers, lumberjacks, people that worked out in the forest, they were a lot like migrant workers of today in that they would travel. If there were timber jobs up in Maine, they might be up in Maine one summer timbering, and then the next year might find them down in West by God, Virginia, or Pennsylvania, or somewhere more south if that's where the work was. So there was this tiny little timber town there at Burnt House, and a lot of times they wouldn't even name these communities because they'd go in there, they'd stand there about 18 months, get out all the sizable timber, and then they'd leave. So the houses they built were quite simple, nothing fancy, and rarely was there ever even any women or children around. Sometimes, if it was more of a permanent measure being taken, like where the actual mills would go in, those would be more permanent settlements. A lot of them are still there today, though many of them are ghost town-ish. Not entirely abandoned, but pretty close to it. But here, of course, in these towns, you get your families and whatnot. But here at Burnt House, it was just work for lumberjacks. So they had several houses built. Men would come. They'd take up residence in the house. Well, at this particular house, these two particular men, my friend's grandmother was telling us, took up residence. And everybody just referred to them as peculiar bachelors. Peculiar bachelors. Now, what's a peculiar bachelor? Anybody watching this over 70 would know, but there's not a whole lot of folks over 70 watching this, and you'd probably have to be from the South. Well, I'll tell it to you like she told it to us. She said that when these two men showed up, all the other workers just assumed that it was a father and a son, because the age difference was spot on to justify that assumption, but it wasn't the case. They asked them, so you guys a father and son team? They said no. They said, oh, so we're just really close. We're just really close friends. And so everybody's like, huh, okay, well, you can have this house when we're building this other house. You can have the other house when it's finished, they said to the other guy. Well, okay, so that's the second time someone or something has thrown something at me. I know you've seen it, you've heard the last one, and you just heard that. And ironically, I was wiping my face like that when it happened, so it wasn't me tossing something down, but it seems to be just like a chunk of wood. strange. Things may get stranger, so keep watching. See, that's what it sounded like. So anyway, they were like, oh no. Now I heard a very distinct tree knock, and I'm hearing voices. Guys, this story's conjuring the spirits, the demons, or something. I'll tell you, a lot of these stories you've never heard, they've never been told because there are forces that don't want them to be told. All right. So let me get back to the telling because I don't know how long I'm going to stay up here in this forest. So, no, we just like to stay together. They said we're going to live in this house together. Everybody's like, okay. It's a bit peculiar. Like, where are your wives? You leave them back home? Oh, we're not married. We don't have wives. So are you kind of picking up what I'm laying down here? This whole peculiar bachelor thing. So, as time went on, people started noticing at least once a month or so, these two guys would kind of sneak away and they'd sneak out of the camp and they'd just disappear. They'd start walking up the mountain into the woods and they would come back just before it was about time to get up and go to work the next morning. And these lumberjacks back in the day, I mean, they were up before the sun, and when it was light enough to see, these guys were felling timber. Really, this is back in the day before labor unions, and these guys used to work 18 hours a day. I read a massive history on the history of logging in the Virginias, and back when there were one state, when the railroads came in, and it just, again, I'm segueing here. A lot of people hate this, a lot of people love it. Those guys would be so tired from working 18-hour days. They did it 7 days a week. When they finally they would have trains that would go up to the top of the mountains and pick the guys up at the end of the day when it was just before dark, and then bring them back down with the last load of logs. This is, when trains started replacing horses, pulling logs out. These guys would be so exhausted, they would lay down to sleep and they would rest their ear on the train tracks because they were just so exhausted they were afraid they'd miss a train, but they figured, well, if I rest my head on the train track, the vibration of the train will wake me up. I'll hear it'll wake me up. Sometimes they were so exhausted they didn't wake up and they were decapitated laying there waiting on those trains. True story. You could Google that. It's part of history. And that's one of the reasons why unions were eventually created and justified. I mean, hey, 8-hour day, 10-hour day, great. 12-hour day, if you're up for it, great. But an 18-hour day, that's just not right. So anyway, not that I'm a supporter. I'm not for them or against them. I can see their goods and I can see their evils. You know what I'm saying? So necessary evil, I guess, is what I'd say is my view of those union things. It's unfortunate that they protect dirt bags. You can't get rid of the dirt bags, and boy, the good workers will get used and abused. Whew. All right. I got way off track there. I heard some really creepy, like cackling type noises up here. They're like, get on with it. Okay, so, but then it got even stranger. They had a cook here in the camp, and he started missing animals that he would use, of course, to slaughter to feed the men. And when he would mention this, nobody knew what was going on. Once it was a goat, and then about a month later it was a pig. One of the guys claimed that he heard what sounded like a pig squealing coming from the top of the mountain just the night before. Of course, nobody knew anything about these missing pigs, and they asked the peculiar bachelors if they knew anything about the pig. Well, we don't know nothing about the pig. People started asking them about their once monthly, nightly disappearances. They're like, oh, sometimes we can't sleep. We go out for a walk, but we show up for work all the time, every time, on time. So you can't. There's nothing. What's in any business of yours? And everybody's like, yeah, okay, trying to mind their own business while not minding their own business. Well, a couple of the guys started looking around, and they went up to where that one guy said he heard what sounded like a pig squealing. that one night when the pig had gone missing, and they found bones, animal bones. They could tell a pig's skull. They found what looked like an altar, because at first they thought these guys were doing some really strange things with these animals. If you're picking up what I'm laying down, this is social media, so I'm really making it clean here. But they got up there, and it occurred to them that maybe there was something more peculiar than what they thought going on, as if in these two guys were getting together and going up there and having some sort of sacrifice. So they go back to the camp. Another very loud tree knock, thunderous tree knock. That one was closer than the last one. Keep watching back here, huh? So they go back to the camp. The next day, when everybody goes to work, these two guys stay behind with permission of the camp boss. And so they go into the house where these two peculiar bachelors live, and they start going through their stuff. And they find like these leather-bound wow, I might need to start drinking more water and less coffee. It's like I just got this blinding, like, that hasn't happened in a long time. It's like I got like a headache and dizzy for just a second. What's in this coffee? It's just coffee. It was. So anyway, they found like these leather-bound journals, and to this date, no one knows what was written in those books, because they said it was so deranged, and it just couldn't. They had pictures drawn and diagrams. It was like devil worship. Okay, nobody was specific, but it was devil worship. Enough said. And this is back in the time when, I mean, they were probably still hanging women or for being accused of being witches in Appalachistan in the mid 1800s, late 1800s, because they're a little behind there. It takes them a while to catch up, if ever, with modern society, current affairs. But they determined these two guys are no good, and they don't particularly want them in their camp, because who knows what they might subject some of the other guys to, some of the other workers. So they waited for them, a couple of them, for the next night that they were to go out, and they followed them. And they followed them up to where they'd found the altar and where they had found the bones. And they didn't have any animals that night, no sacrificing of animals, but just a bunch of chanting, bunch of lightings of candles, and other activities which were never discussed, is the way Grandma told the story. Well, we read into that, and we figured they're doing some really freaky stuff up there in the woods, these two peculiar bachelors. So the guys that followed them went back to camp. While they walked away. Once the clothes came off, they walked away, went back to camp, got the camp boss. They're like, this is what we saw. They're having some sort of really odd demonic ritual that matches the stuff we found in the books. And it turns out those leather-bound books, the leather was made of some sort of skin that wasn't a cow, okay? And the camp boss says, we can't have this. And those two men ain't good for nothing. They're no good for the rest of the world. So we're going to meet them when they come home. And sure enough, they did. The sun wasn't up yet. The rest of the men weren't up, getting ready to go to work. Still dark. And all that everyone in the camp knows is that they heard 6 gunshots. The entire camp was awakened to the sound of 6 gunshots, the reports of which sounded like 3 shots from two different firearms. And they came to the sound of the shooting, and it was the house where these two peculiar bachelors lived. And they lay there in front of it dead, just blood coming out and oozing, big puddles of blood. And of course, the camp boss shows up, playing dumb. The 2 guys that followed him into the woods shows up, playing dumb, asking everybody, what's going on here? What's been going on here? And everybody's like, we don't know. We just heard gunshots. And now at that point, it starts to get light enough to see. So they looking down, and they notice that this blood, where the blood's pooling, these massive hordes of horseflies just come flying into the blood, sucking up the blood immediately, as if they were sent there. And the camp boss is like, boys, this ain't right. This is ungodly. This is of the devil. We're not even burying these peculiar bachelors. Throw them in the house and light it on fire. And that's what they did. They threw them in there and they piled as much wood in there, as much tinder as they could get. They lit that stuff on fire. It burned. The house burned. And I'm seeing movement up here. You watch. I heard a voice and then movement up in here. So they burned the house to the ground, burned the bodies, leave no evidence. Guys, there is no one out here with me. All right, so anyway, the logging operation didn't stay there much longer after that. It's not that they left because of what had happened. They were about ready to be finished timbering that whole mountainside anyway, so they left. And then ever since then, like grandmother was telling us, for years after years after years after years, people stayed away from the area. It didn't matter if it was the elderberries that we went to pick in that spot where that house was, where they had burned it to the ground. Always tasted nasty. And for some reason, anybody that ever got bitten by horseflies in that area had the same reaction we did. You'd swell up like a rattlesnake. And my buddy told his grandma, I said, gosh, grandma, all these years you've known this and you're just now telling me? And he says, if I'd have known this the whole time, I would have never gone there today. And our hands, they stopped stinging and the swelling had stopped, but they were still swollen up. And he says, why didn't you just tell me this before and this would have never happened? And she says, well, you know, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. You can lead a boy to college, but you can't make him think. Says you can tell everybody not to do this and not to do that, but until they're dumb enough to go out and do it on their own and get burnt for it, they don't learn. They're not going to listen to you. And she said, I bet you boys will never go picking berries up there at Burnt House again. And we both said, no, we won't, and no, we haven't. And for now, there's a horsefly circling around my ankle. I'm getting out of here. See you for more next time.